Have you ever wondered if Ashur's character is dangerously close to reality? If the series only showed a shadow of who a real Syrian ludus owner could have been? And if Rome actually crossed paths with men like him, sharp, relentless, and far too independent? So who was the man whose shadow may have inspired Ashur's character? What real story could have existed where Rome's authority collided with Eastern ambition? And most of all, why did men like him become legends, even when others tried to erase their names? Have you ever wondered how a man from Syria could end up standing beside Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the most powerful figures of the late Republic? History tells us this wasn't as impossible as it sounds. Rome routinely relied on provincial outsiders for the kind of work senators wouldn't dare stain their hands with. Syrians, Assyrians, and Nabateans often served as translators, informants, and cultural intermediaries, men comfortable operating between worlds. Their usefulness gave them proximity to power, but never true acceptance. And this tension, needed yet never welcomed, forms the core of Ashur's archetype. It mirrors a mechanism that was all too real in Rome's political machinery. Power in Rome wasn't upheld by legions alone. It also relied on the invisible labor of foreigners who handled the empire's darker business. Spying on rebels, negotiating ransoms, running illicit markets, bribing officials, these tasks rarely fell to Romans themselves. Historical chronicles describe gray intermediaries, men who operated in the legal shadows, but under the protection of high-ranking patrons. Syrians and Assyrians were especially valued because they understood both the Roman system and the world beyond it. Crassus, a master strategist of wealth and influence, needed such people constantly. And this is why Ashur's type wasn't an anomaly, it was a necessity. Across the 1st century BCE, Syria wasn't merely another Roman territory. It was a collision point of trade routes, religions, and rival empires. Growing up there meant hearing multiple languages, navigating shifting political landscapes, and learning to survive between competing powers. Such an environment shaped people who could adapt quickly, negotiate instinctively, and read danger long before it arrived. Inscriptions and contracts found by archaeologists show Syrians working as brokers, diplomats, tax agents, even facilitators of slave markets. Ashur fits perfectly into this tradition, a man shaped by a frontier culture where loyalty was transactional and survival demanded flexibility. His profile is historically recognizable. Roman ideology worshipped strength, pedigree, and warrior virtue. Cunning, adaptability, and emotional intelligence, especially in foreigners, were treated with suspicion. Satirical texts portray Syrians as clever, evasive, and unnervingly perceptive. Romans relied on them while simultaneously despising the traits that made them useful. Real sources describe a deep cultural prejudice toward Orientals, who were seen as too smart, too smooth, too quick to read the room. This contradiction created a fragile existence for men in Ashur's position. And it explains why power for him always came wrapped in danger. History is full of individuals who climbed Rome's hierarchy not through muscle, but through manipulation. Narcissus, once a slave, became a political titan. Tigellinus, a provincial of questionable origin, became a kingmaker under Nero. Zeno, another outsider, controlled financial arteries of entire regions. They thrived because they did what Romans hated to do yet desperately needed: negotiate, maneuver, uncover secrets. Their ascent followed a consistent pattern: survival through intellect and strategy. And Ashur's trajectory mirrors that pattern almost exactly. While most lanistae were Romans, history records exceptions. Wealthy freedmen, financiers, and ambitious provincials sometimes acquired gladiatorial schools or invested in their operations. A ludus was a business, and a profitable one. It demanded negotiation skills, financial literacy, and the management of volatile fighters. Provincial administrators often held roles inside these schools, ranging from procurement to full oversight. So the idea of Ashur becoming a ludus master after the Spartacus uprising isn't simply narrative drama, it's structurally plausible. His rise fits a path some provincials genuinely walked. A ludus wasn't just a training hall, it was a self-contained microstate. Doctors shaped fighters, procurators handled finances, and the lanistae enforced discipline and maintained contracts with wealthy patrons. But beneath this hierarchy ran a dense web of alliances, rivalries, and personal agendas. Gladiators formed factions, trainers competed for influence, and administrators quietly negotiated with politicians. Chaos simmered constantly. In such an environment, men like Ashur, observant, calculating, unnoticed until needed, became crucial stabilizers. He fits the archetype of the man who knows how everything works even if he commands no physical strength. Crassus wasn't just a politician. He was one of the most aggressive financiers in Roman history. He invested in collapsing real estate, mining operations, private fire brigades, and yes, gladiator enterprises. Such ventures required people who could act outside polite society, negotiating bribes, delivering threats, and navigating criminal markets. Foreigners dependent on his favor made perfect operatives. They had no ties, no allies, and no way out except through loyalty. The series captures this dynamic with surprising accuracy. Ashur isn't an accident in Crassus's orbit. He's a calculated asset. Rome ran on men like him far more than it liked to admit. Rome consumed men like Ashur as long as they were useful. The moment they became inconvenient, too visible, or too ambitious, they vanished. Some rose to staggering influence because they controlled information. Others disappeared between the lines of history, removed quietly by those they served. This precarious balance defined their lives. To be indispensable was safety, to misstep was death. And a real Ashur would have lived exactly on that knife's edge. His fictional arc reflects the fate of many real-world intermediaries caught between patronage and annihilation. Gladiator schools didn't run on brute force alone. They relied on informants, servi delators, enslaved administrators who monitored tensions, exposed plots, and preserved discipline from within. These men held knowledge that could make or break a ludus. Fighters feared them, trainers tolerated them, masters depended on them. Roman writers describe such roles with surprising frequency. Ashur fits seamlessly into this category, not a warrior, but the man who knows every weakness in the room. And in ancient Rome, that knowledge was a weapon. Ashur isn't just a Syrian, and not just a former slave. He embodies the intersection of three forces: Eastern adaptability, Roman political utility, and the brutal ecosystem of the gladiatorial world. He survives where stronger men fall because survival is his craft. He is never truly Roman, yet he becomes indispensable to Romans. His uniqueness comes from his ability to navigate systems built to crush men like him. And if such a person had lived in history, he would have resembled Ashur far more closely than we might expect. When you connect all the historical threads, Ashur stops looking like a fictional villain and starts resembling a very real type of Roman-era operator. A provincial intermediary. A man tolerated for his usefulness and hated for the same reason. Someone who lived in the shadows of power, shaping events without ever belonging to the world he served. And that's what makes him one of the most historically believable characters in the entire series. Have you ever considered that a gladiator school wasn't just a training yard, but a small-scale model of the Roman Empire? Inside it lived its own elites, its own punishments, its own backroom markets, and its own unwritten rules. Gladiators competed not only in the arena, but for favor, privileges, and protection. Administrators made decisions the same way senators did, weighing fear, alliances, and hidden incentives. In this environment, cunning mattered just as much as strength. A ludus thrived on intrigue, negotiation, and intimidation, and these forces created pathways for men who rose without ever lifting a sword. Seen from within, it becomes obvious. Ashur wasn't an exception. He was exactly the kind of man this system was built to produce. At first glance, a ludus looks ruled by fighters, but true authority rested elsewhere. A precise administrative ladder structured every decision. Doctors, the weapons masters, procurators, the managers, lanistae, the owners, and a whole layer of intermediaries who carried out the real work. Often these in-between, men became the most influential figures inside the walls. They delivered orders, enforced discipline, and resolved conflicts. Roman writers note that owners valued those who listened, remembered, and observed. And the fewer allies such a man had among fighters, the more the owners trusted him. Dependence made him reliable. In such a hierarchy, Ashur could become indispensable far faster than any champion of the arena. A gladiator school was a powder keg. Dozens of armed men, often humiliated, hungry, angry, and ready to revolt. Force alone couldn't contain them. Not even chains were enough. Administrators needed eyes and ears inside the barracks, someone who could sense tension, report alliances, track emerging threats. Romans understood that one well-placed informant prevented more bloodshed than a squad of guards. These internal ears were standard practice, not an anomaly. And a Syrian outsider with no faction of his own, entirely dependent on the owner, made the perfect candidate. In the series, Ashur occupies exactly the position historians describe as a necessary instrument of control. Romans rarely trusted gladiators, too strong, too proud, too unpredictable. But a man with no strength, no friends, and no roots was another matter entirely. An outsider dependent on his masters was far less dangerous than a respected fighter. That's why provincials and foreign-born slaves were often appointed to administrative roles. They had no personal following, no internal power, no ability to rally a rebellion. Ashur fits perfectly into this model of dependence equals trust. And the less respect he had among fighters, the higher he could climb with administrators. Most imagined gladiator schools existed for combat, but they were, above all, commercial enterprises. Revenue came from betting, private rentals of fighters, political contracts, and elite sponsorships. And wherever money flowed, so did hidden ledgers, favors, and deals behind closed doors. Administrators relied on people who could count, negotiate, conceal, and report. Men like Ashur became the bridge between the arena and the owner's coin purses. And it was this economic shadow world that allowed such men to become far more important than anyone expected. Muscle ruled the arena, but power belonged to those who understood psychology and structure. Memory, observation, adaptability, the ability to read a man's motives in a single glance, these were the true tools of influence. Provincials, used to surviving through diplomacy rather than force, excelled here. Roman writers called such men callidi, sharp, cautious minds who operated through intellect. In a ludus, these skills made a man not just useful, but irreplaceable. And that is why Ashur's ascent feels not like fantasy, but historical logic. Gladiator schools were driven by constant internal warfare, rivalries among trainers, clashes between fighter factions, battles over privileges. In such chaos, every conflict created a power vacuum. And clever intermediaries were the first to slip into those openings. They instigated, negotiated, informed, and manipulated, becoming the knots through which every tension had to pass. Where strength generated fear, cunning generated influence. Ashur is one of those knots. And the series depicts this mechanism with striking accuracy. Crassus wasn't just wealthy, he was a high-risk investor and political tactician. He poured money into ventures others feared. Mines, real estate, slave factories, private fire brigades, gladiator schools. These operations required people who obeyed without hesitation and carried out delicate tasks without moral resistance. Political risks, covert agreements, dangerous errands, such duties fell to those who had no choice but to obey. A provincial fully dependent on his patron was the ideal instrument. Ashur fits that mold exactly, and the series captures this dynamic with surprising fidelity. Rome used such men ruthlessly and discarded them just as quickly. As long as they were useful, they thrived. But once they became too visible, too ambitious, or too informed, they vanished. History is full of intermediaries who simply disappeared when they ceased to be convenient. Yet others survived because they mastered the art of sensing danger before it arrived. Ashur constantly walks this line between usefulness and contempt. And historically, that was the only way someone like him lived long enough to matter. Ancient sources often describe figures who acted not as fighters, but as monitors and brokers within a ludus. These were not warriors. They were information nodes, watching rivalries, exposing plots, and reporting to trainers. Fighters feared them because they knew everyone's weaknesses. They were hated because they survived where stronger men fell. But structurally, such men were essential. Ashur is a fictionalized, but remarkably accurate version of this archetype. When a lanistae died or lost power, gladiators could be sold or executed. Trainers might be replaced, but the lower administrative staff, the ones who knew how the system worked, were often kept. They carried the institutional memory of the household. Men without roots, trained to adapt instantly to new masters, survived transitions better than anyone else. And Roman history confirms this. The flexible, the cunning, the dependent lived longer than the strong. Ashur's survival in the series isn't fantasy. It reflects a real mechanism of Roman society. Once you assemble all the evidence, a clear picture emerges. Ashur isn't an anomaly, he's a pattern. He represents the composite figure of a Roman intermediary, a foreigner who existed at the crossroads of power, discipline, and fear. He embodies a system where strength bowed to cunning, and loyalty was purchased through dependency. And the deeper we look into the history of gladiator schools, the more obvious it becomes. Ashur's character captures the reality of the era with uncanny precision. When we see Ashur kill a gladiator in front of everyone, it looks like brutal drama written for shock. But in reality, administrators of a ludus did sometimes resort to violence to keep control over an explosive group of fighters. Roman sources mention intermediaries running schools who personally executed slaves that broke discipline or stirred up unrest. It wasn't about showing off strength. It was about survival, about holding on to status through fear. These executions were often public, precisely to reduce the chances of revolt. The scene in the series mirrors this very real mechanism of rule through terror. In that moment, Ashur isn't acting as a warrior, but as a man of the system. Chorix stands for Rome's muscle power, while Ashur embodies the administrative, unseen, but equally dangerous kind. Roman history shows these two forms of authority constantly clashing in army camps and gladiator schools. Commanders relied on physical force, but they were just as dependent on those who could manage men psychologically. Chorix senses a threat to his dominance in Ashur, and Ashur senses a threat to his influence in Chorix. In systems like this, physical weakness could turn into political strength. That tension is exactly what their confrontation on screen is really about, not respect, but power. Those moments where Romans tolerate Ashur but speak about him with contempt are surprisingly accurate. Historical accounts show that bureaucrats, scribes, and intermediaries were indispensable to governance. They knew too much, did the dirtiest work, and held together complex structures Roman elites didn't want to touch directly. They were shielded because the system needed them, and despised because they violated the Roman ideal of true manliness. Ashur is a perfect embodiment of this type, essential to the elite, yet repulsive to it. That made his position both privileged and dangerously exposed. At first glance, the build-up to the festival of Liber looks like pure spectacle. But behind it stands a very real logic. Mass games and public shows in honor of the gods were key tools of political influence. Owners of a ludus used these events to display power, loyalty, and wealth. Choosing which gladiator would fight wasn't a sports decision. It was a political move. A mistake on such an occasion could cost influence, allies, and future backing. That's why the pressure characters feel in the series perfectly matches reality. Fights held for Liber weren't entertainment first. They were politics wearing a mask. When an important gladiator dies in the series, we feel it as a personal tragedy. But in real life, it would also have been an economic and political blow. Gladiators were investments, trained over years, bought, sold, and rented out. The loss of a top fighter could derail an owner's plans, destroy contracts, and anger powerful patrons. In Capua and Pompeii, there are records of champion deaths leading to changes in management. So the show is right. Losing a gladiator meant losing money, status, and leverage. And Ashur, in that chaos, is simply trying to survive inside a collapsing balance. On the surface, sending the inexperienced Logas against 3 dwarf fighters seems absurd. But in Roman practice, weak or unprepared fighters were often thrown into the arena as part of political deals or for comic effect. Dwarfs, dwarf fighters, and other curiosity combatants are mentioned in Martial, Suetonius, and others. Sometimes a weak man was sent out deliberately to make the show bloodier or to tilt betting odds for someone's profit. The series gets this right. Logas is not an accident. He's a sacrifice made by the system. Men like him were bought, used, and discarded with terrifying ease. The scene where 3 dwarfs kill Logas feels grotesque, theatrical, almost unreal. Yet it's rooted in genuine Roman practice. Romans did stage novelty fights, using diminutive fighters, exotic animals, or men with unusual bodies. It was part of a culture of humiliation, where an unequal victory was entertainment for the crowd. Through Logas, the series shows how the entertainment market turned human beings into consumables. His death reflects a time when the value of a life was measured in crowd reaction. And scenes like this capture the raw cruelty of the Roman world with brutal clarity. When wealthy guests mock Ashur at the banquet, it looks like mere personal bullying. But in Roman culture, This functioned as a loyalty and obedience test. Banquets were stages for hierarchy. The powerful humiliated the weak and watched how they responded. If a man endured humiliation, he might be trusted with new tasks. If he showed pride, he could be quietly removed from the circle. It was an ancient filter for safe people. Ashur passes this test the same way many historical intermediaries did before him, by swallowing his pride to stay alive. In the moment Ashur decides to bring Achillia into the house, he's acting exactly in line with Roman logic. Buying a strong slave could raise a master's status. Owners often acquired talented fighters, performers, or craftsmen, specifically to elevate their own standing. Achillia is not just a captive. She is capital, leverage, a living symbol. Ashur understands that the strength of others can be converted into his own power. And the scene lays bare a very old mechanism, human abilities treated as pieces in an economic game. The series portrays this with almost documentary accuracy. In real life, lanistae rarely executed administrators or intermediaries, even when they crossed the line. The reason is simple: good managers were hard to replace. They knew the system, understood the fighters, had connections, and carried the operating manual of the school in their heads. Killing a man like that meant breaking your own control structure. So owners often preferred exile, dismissal, or forced removal over execution. The scene where Ashur is pushed out reflects this political calculus. He's too valuable to waste, but too risky to keep close. Roman authors describe such outcomes as mercy with a business logic. Female gladiators did exist, and archaeology backs that up. They trained, fought, and sometimes performed in group battles. But women in the arena were always treated as a spectacle, an exception, something staged to shock the audience. The scene where Achillia fights several men at once is rooted in descriptions of exhibition bouts, where women were matched against weaker or exhausted opponents. It was a form of crowd entertainment and a statement piece for the sponsor. The show adds drama, but the core idea is historically sound, a woman weaponized as a tool of male power. And in that framework, Achillia fits Roman show culture perfectly. From Ashur's killing of a gladiator, to his humiliation at the banquet, to the purchase of a talented slave, each of these scenes reflects real, documented mechanisms of Roman power. The series doesn't just stage drama. It reconstructs a world where fear, politics, money, and human weakness were welded into one system. Ashur isn't cartoon evil. He's a composite portrait of how the weak survived in a world built for the strong. And that's why his story feels disturbingly authentic. Friends, make sure you subscribe. We've got many more deep dives into films and series ahead. Thanks for watching.